Welcome to our next tutorial in my tutorial library. This one's going to be a little bit different. We are not making a block. We are not doing some sort of fancy scenes. We're going to be talking about binding your quilt. This is the last thing you do before your quilt is finished. So you've already made all your blocks. You put them all together. You got a nice pretty quilt top. You put any borders on that you want on. You've made your backing. You've either sent it to the long armor or you've quilted it yourself, and you are ready to bind your quilt. So let's talk about that process. So let's talk about, this is our little sample that we're going to use. It's just a small one because it fits on camera better because it's small. Obviously, principle's the same as if you were doing a big quilt. This quilt has got, a little top. It's just basically a tabletop, a little top, a little backing. It's got some batting in there and some very basic quilting done on it. Let's talk about binding. There's various ways to make your binding. First of all, you have to make your binding, and then you have to apply your binding. And in applying your binding, there's a couple of places where people find it a little tricky. So let's talk first about making the binding. A lot of times these days, quilt designers will just tell you to cut strips the width of your fabric and just make straight of the grain binding. That's fine. It works. I will tell you, I prefer a bias binding. The reason being because your binding, the highest point of stress on your binding is right at the edge of your quilt. If you cut your fabric straight of the grain to make your binding, you only have one set of threads crossing over that high stress area. The other set of threads from the fabric just go along here, and they're not helping to reinforce that stress. If you make a bias binding, threads go this way, threads of your fabric cross, and all the threads of your binding fabric cover this high stress edge, and so it makes it a stronger binding. Also, if your quilt's not square, if you've done something fancy like scalloped the edges, you have to use a bias binding, because a bias binding, you can stretch and ease around curves. So that's another reason I prefer bias binding. So there's that. I'll show you how to do both. Once we get your strips made, the technique is the same for applying it, whether it's bias or straight. So I'll show you how to make your straight strips if that's what you want. I'll show you how to do bias binding, which is the way I prefer to do it. Also, you need to decide how wide do you want your binding. A lot of quilt designers will tell you to cut your strips 2¼ inches wide, and then you're just going to use a tiny little 1/4 inch seam allowance putting it on, which makes a very tiny, tiny little binding. For me, I actually prefer a slightly wider binding, and I use a 3/8 to 1/2 inch seam allowance on my binding. I cut my binding strips to 3 inches wide. It just gives a little more strength. It gives a little more. It's not just artistically, your eye doesn't just stop. It says, oh yeah, here's the end. Also, another reason I prefer a wider binding is that I don't have time to hand sew the second side of my binding, to be totally honest. So I do a decorative top stitch, and it's just easier to do a decorative top stitch on a slightly wider binding. So let's also talk about, once you apply your binding to your quilt, the first side of your binding, you're going to apply raw edges to one side or the other. You need to decide whether you're going to hand sew or machine sew the second side of your binding before you do the first one. If you're going to be hand sewing the second edge down, which is what I'm doing on this little quilt here. This one's been in progress quite a long time, and so I'm hand sewing. You hand sew onto the back, the second edge on the back of the quilt, because you don't want your stitches to show, and sometimes your hand sewing stitches show, and if you have them on the back, no big deal, right? Well, if you're going to do top stitching, if you're going to machine sew decorative top stitching, you're first going to sew your binding onto the back of the quilt and fold it over to the front so you can actually see where the decorative top stitching is going on the front, the side that people are going to be looking at. If you sewed it on the if you machine sewed the first edge on the front and folded it over to the back and then did your decorative top stitching, you wouldn't actually know exactly where those stitches are going on the front side until you're done sewing, and you may take it off there and go, ooh, that doesn't look good, and then you'd have to pick it all out, which you don't want to do. So if you're going to machine sew the second edge of your binding, the first side you sew on, you're going to sew onto the back and then fold it over to the front. If you're going to hand sew the second edge of your binding, you're going to sew your binding onto the front, like I did on this one, and then you're going to hand sew on the back side. So let's talk about math. There is math involved. You need to know how much fabric you need to make your binding. All right, so this is a fairly small quilt, which I think I can get all in screen. About roughly a yard on each side. But if you're looking at a big quilt like this one, you got to do some math. You got to do math anyways, but here's the math for binding your quilt. You need to know the finished size all the way around your quilt. So this small one is roughly a yard on each side, so it's a total of approximately 4 yards around. This big quilt, by my math, is 68 by 84 and a half all the way around. So the math is the width plus the height. So 1, 2, and assuming it's a rectangle, it's the width plus the height times 2. Or if you really want to double check, width, height, there you go. And that is how long your binding strip needs to be. Now, fabric comes 40 to 42 inches wide. So you're going to take your all the way around size. You're going to divide by, I'm going to divide by 40. That gives a little extra wiggle room. It's also an easier divide than dividing by 42. So you divide by 40. And you come up with, that's going to be how many strips of fabric you would need if you were doing just with the fabric, straight of the grain strips. Now here's the key. You actually need the same amount of fabric to do it on the bias as you do straight. So if a lot of times for bias binding, they tell you, instructions are to figure out what size square of fabric, which doesn't fill up the full width of fabric. I'm going to show you how to do bias binding using the full width of fabric. It's not a square, it's a rectangle. It takes exactly the same amount of fabric. Actually may take slightly more fabric to do on the bias than on the straight of the grain, just because there are you'll lose a little bit more in seams. But generally it's the same amount. So anyway, where were we? So we have our length all the way around, divided by 40. That's how many strips of fabric you would need to cut. Okay, and now always round up. You're not going to cut a partial width of fabric. Always round up. So if it's like if your calculator says you need 4.2 strips of fabric, you need 5 strips of fabric. Now, if you're actually close to the end, if it says you need 4.8 strips of fabric, I actually would add one more. So not just 5, I would say 6 at that point. Because mitering the corners and seams can take up a little bit more fabric than you realize. All right, so once we know how many strips of fabric we need, then we need to remember how wide are we cutting this. In my case, like I say, I tend to like a 3-inch strip of fabric. So how many strips of fabric times the width of fabric, or times the width of your strips, tells you how much fabric you need. In this case, each side is roughly a yard. Fabric is 42 inches wide. I'm just doing rough math in my head. I'm figuring one strip each side, 4 strips of fabric. I could do more exact math and maybe I only need 3. I don't know, but we're going to do with 4. So that would be at 4 strips of fabric times 3 inches wide would be 12 inches width of fabric for this one. For this quilt, I've done the math, and I've done the math on my computer. I don't have it in my head, but I had figured out that I needed 8 strips of fabric at 3 inches wide. That is 24 inches of fabric. And probably should round up, add one more strip just to be sure. So that would be 27 inches of fabric, especially because you need to square it up. Sometimes it comes off the bolt wonky. Always not a bad idea to add one more strip of fabric. So that's the math on binding. So I'll put the math slide up now, and then we'll go over to my cutting counter and I will show you how I'm cutting. Heads up on my cutting, 4 widths of fabric at 3 inches is 12 inches width of fabric. I actually cut my fabric in half, and I have a 24 inch by half width of fabric piece that I'm going to be using. Again, it's actually the same amount of fabric, just like a fat quarter is the same amount of fabric as a quarter yard. It just fits the camera screen better. So I'll put the math slide up and we'll go over to my cutting counter and I'll show you how to get started making a bias binding from a rectangle, not a square. The first type of binding I'm going to show you how to make is actually the straight grain binding. This is the width of fabric. So you're simply going to cut your strips however wide you want them across the width of the fabric and sew these strips together end to end using a diagonal seam. The reason for the diagonal seam is that if you did a straight 90-degree seam, all 6 layers of seam allowances would end up piled up on top of each other in your seam binding and making it very thick. So the diagonal seam spreads out that seam allowance. How you do this diagonal seam? It's just like how we did flip and fold corners. Lay your 2 strips together, right sides together, at a 90-degree angle, so they're forming an L, and just sew diagonally across the square that is formed by the overlap of the ends of the strips. Trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, trimming off the excess triangles of fabric, and you are now ready to press all the seams. I will put a time stamp in the video for you to know where to skip to get to the pressing instructions. Let's now talk bias bindings. How do we make bias bindings? These first few steps are the same. if you're going to make just bias strips and sew them together end to end, or if you're going to do continuous bias binding. So these first few steps are still the same for both types of bias bindings. So you want to press your fabric flat, and pressing out any wrinkles from the bowl. Definitely press out that center fold, and then make sure both cut edges are reasonably straight. They often come off the bolt a bit wonky, you know. And also, you also need to make sure that those cut edges are 90 degrees from the selvages, that they're not going off, again, not going off wonky, diagonally sort of twisted thing. Lay your fabric out on a large cutting mat, wrong side up, and take a long ruler, probably do need a fairly long ruler, start at one corner and lay it at a 45-degree angle up across the fabric and just cut along the edge of that ruler. You've cut a triangle off, you have a trapezoid left, pick up the triangle that you've cut off and move it over to the other side of the trapezoid to form a parallelogram. You see your parallelogram, you're now going to sew those two pieces of fabric together. So obviously fold them right sides together and sew that seam. If you've left the selvages on, which I often do, sew with a 1-inch seam allowance and then trim it down to a 1/4 inch after you've got it sewn. If you've taken the selvages off, just use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this seam. You're now going to press these seam allowances open. I know most of the time I tell you to press your seam allowances to one side so that there's not like a possible gap where batting fibers could work their way through. But in your binding, you don't have to worry about that. You have enough layers stacked up and your seams are not stacked on top of each other. There's not going to be any gaps for binding fibers to work their way through. You actually want to press your seams open, again, to reduce bulk, because in your finished product, you have 6 layers of binding fabric. You want to spread the bulk out as much as you can to keep it as smooth as you can. You now have a parallelogram of fabric. Your next choice is to either simply cut your bias strips or to make continuous bias binding. If you just want to cut bias strips, just start at the diagonal edge of the parallelogram and cut as many strips of your desired width as you can, and then sew these bias strips together end to end using, of course, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that your seams still go diagonally across the width of this, which they should. You're just going to sew as they are. And then I will put the timestamp down at the bottom for where the pressing instructions start. Let's talk about continuous bias binding. If you're like me, I prefer one long seam rather than several short seams, so I do a continuous bias binding. I'll show you how that works. Starting at the diagonal edge of your parallelogram, you're not going to cut your strips their width. You're just going to draw lines which will eventually become your cutting line after you have your seam sewn. You also need to draw your stitching line when you're making a continuous bias binding, at least where it crosses the diagonal lines that you have drawn. You can draw it all the way along. You at least need to do it at where it crosses the stitching line. So along the straight grain edges of your parallelogram, draw a line a 1/4 inch away from from each edge. Now let's prepare the seam. Bring the straight grain edges of this parallelogram to meet, right sides together. You're going to form a tube. The diagonal lines you drew should not form rings around this tube, however. They need to form a spiral around this tube. So the end of one line does not meet up with the other end of the same line. It needs to meet up with the other end of the next line down. The seam, when you are all done, is going to spiral around the tube as well. The reason why you had to draw those stitching lines at the 1/4 inch away from the straight grain edge is because you need to match up where the diagonal lines cross that 1/4 inch stitching line not where those diagonal lines end up at the edge of the fabric. If you matched them up at the end of the fabric, your spiral would not meet properly after it's sewn together. Use enough pins to hold everything together, carefully matching up your, again, this where the stitching line crosses the diagonal lines. And possibly you need to put, depending on the width of your strips, you may need to put a pin or two in the spaces between those markings. And I am going to tell you, leave those pins in while you sew. I know most people don't do that. Leave those pins in while you sew. Otherwise things are going to go way wonky. Go back over to your sewing machine and sew this seam. Because it spirals around the tube, you are going to probably need to pause and adjust the fabric under the machine several times. Just make sure when you stop that the machine needle is down through the fabric to hold everything in place so things don't move around on you. Okay, now go ahead and remove your pins and grab your fabric shears, not your rotary cutter, because you're only going to be cutting through one layer of fabric. Grab your fabric shears and carefully cut down the diagonal lines that you drew should now be one single long spiral. So go ahead and cut your fabric open on that diagonal line. If you've got a little tail strip that is not as wide as the rest, cut that off as well. And then we'll get to pressing. Now let's press our binding strip. We're going to press all of the seams open. Contrary to the rest of the quilt, you're not going to press these seam allowances to one side. You're going to press them open in order to reduce the bulk in the finished quilt binding, and make sure you trim off any dog ears that are hanging out. And then fold the binding strip in half widthwise, wrong sides together, along the entire length, and press that fold. The strip is going to be the same length it was, but half the width. One long edge will be the fold, and the other long edge will be the two edges of the strip. Now that the binding is made, it's time to apply it to the edge of the quilt. At this point, you do need to finalize your final decision. Set it in stone. Are you going to hand sew the second seam of the application process, or are you going to use a decorative machine top stitch? The process is the same for both, except for which side of the quilt you sew the first seam to. If you're going to hand stitch the second seam, you're going to machine stitch the first seam to the front of the quilt. If you're going to machine top stitch the second seam, you're going to hand sew or machine sew the first seam to the back of the quilt. I do typically do a machine top stitch for the second seam because it's faster. So everything you're going to see in this video shows it machine sewing the second seam. So I'm applying this to the back. Just remember the process is the same. So how we start this: lay the folded binding on the quilt with the edges of the strip even with the edge of the quilt. So this will be the raw edges, not the fold of the strip. It needs to be even with the edge of either the front or the back of the quilt, whichever one you're sewing it to. You're going to start in the middle of one side of the quilt, not at a corner, in the middle, and about 8 inches from one end of the binding strip. So when you start sewing, the size of your seam allowance depends on the width of your binding strip. If you've got the little narrow 2 to 2.5 inch wide binding strip, that's how you originally cut it. So now it's like 1 to 1.25 inches. Just use a little 1/4 inch seam allowance. If your binding strip was wider, like mine, I like to cut mine to 3/8 of an inch or 3 inches wide. Use a 3/8 to 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you've got a thicker batting, you might want to use closer to a 3/8. If you've got a thin batting, use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And let's talk about, we're going to start sewing and we're going to approach the corner for mitering. As you approach your first corner, stop the distance from the end that is equal to the width of the seam allowance. Stop with the needle down. So 1/4 inch seam allowance, stop a 1/4 inch before you get to the end. 3/8 or 1/2 inch seam allowance, stop the 3/8 or 1/2 inch from the end. Turn the quilt so that the point of the corner is facing straight towards you, stitch to and off the corner, and then cut your thread. So you've got a straight line down and then a little diagonal running off the corner of the quilt. Lay the quilt on your table so that the quilt is to your left and the corner that you just stopped at is in front of you. Fold the binding strip to the right. It should have a 45-degree angle with the corner, and then fold it back to the left, forming a 90-degree angle. This should leave a small little folded triangle of fabric over the corner. Secure these folds with pins or clips. Put the quilt back under your sewing machine and resume sewing with your preferred seam allowance down the next side. You do want to start, again, if you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you want to start a 1/4 inch down. You want to leave that little triangle of fabric at the corner loose and flappy. Continue sewing all the remaining corners and sides of the quilt, stopping about 12 inches before you get to the place where you started the first seam. All right, now we need to join the ends of the binding. This is something that a lot of people find difficult to do, so let's go through it step by step. Lay your quilt out on your table, making sure that it's not folded or bunched up in that space where you still need to sew the binding. Place a pin in the quilt in the middle of this space. Now pull the left end of the binding strip across this space and make a mark on the inside of the strip where it crosses the pin. And do the same thing with the right. Pull the right end of the binding strip across the space, make a mark where it crosses the pin. Go ahead and take out that pin you just used as a little marker. You don't need it anymore. Open up the left end of the binding strip and draw a seam line, use your ruler, draw a seam line that starts at the mark you made, up and to the right at a 45-degree angle across the strip. Similarly, open up the right end of the binding strip. Again, mark a seam line, start with the mark you drew, and go up and to the right at a 45-degree angle across the strip. It's very important that you get these two seam line markings going in the same direction. Then with right sides together, match your binding strip seam lines that you have drawn, match them up, fold the quilt out of the way, secure that seam line with pins. It is a bit fiddly, but you can do it. Go back over to your sewing machine and sew on that seam line that you just drew and pinned together. Lay the quilt out again, remove any pins that you've got in the binding, and then lay it out again to just make sure you've not twisted the binding as you've sewn it together. It is actually very easy to accidentally twist that binding as you're trying to get it lined up together. So just double check that. If it all looks good, trim your seam allowances to a 1/4 inch, press them open, and then repress the center fold across this seam. Head on back to your sewing machine and sew closed the gap in this first binding seam. You're now ready to sew the folded edge of the binding to the other side of the quilt. So wrap that folded edge of the binding over the edge of the quilt, covering all the raw edges. And you're either going to hand sew with a whip stitch or an invisible stitch to the back of the quilt, or you're going to use a decorative machine top stitch to sew it to the front side of the quilt, whichever way you decided to do it. You'll see here I'm gluing things down with some basting glue. I have become very fond of basting glue for a multitude of things. It really helps to glue it down. So, because sometimes it's just hard to just hold it under the machine. So that basting glue really helps. You're now ready to sew now that you have everything basted with either basting glue or pins. So sew it up in your method of choice. You see here I am using a decorative top stitch. It's actually a very wide blanket stitch and goes pretty fast around this. At the corners, you're going to have little loose triangles on both the front and the back. So manipulate those as best you can to lay nicely. You probably do need to secure them with a couple extra stitches. All right, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial about how to make binding, how to bind your quilt. Here is our finished little table topper, all bound. Um, I showed you how to cut either straight or bias, how to make the binding strips, either straight or bias, and then how to apply it. And you need to decide, how wide is your binding? Are you going to hand sew or machine sew the second edge down? All that sort of thing. I hope that you found this very helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. YouTube really likes that, and we'll put it in the algorithm better. And leave a comment, and we will see you next time for our next tutorial. Thanks. Bye-bye.